The lights in the studio were always blinding. But none of them were ever bright enough to illuminate the truth behind Lucille Ball's carefully crafted smile. She was the woman who built the golden age of television with her bare hands. The red-haired comet, whose energy lit up American living rooms for decades. Yet beneath the applause, beneath the iconic laugh that became part of the country's cultural heartbeat, lay a story she never intended to tell publicly. A story whispered in private rooms, revealed only to a handful of people in moments when fame felt more like a burden than a blessing. A story about 6 men, 6 actors, 6 forbidden chapters she kept locked away until the weight of silence grew unbearable. To understand the meaning of these affairs, you have to step inside her world. Not the world audiences adored on screen, but the real Hollywood she walked through every day. It was a place where reputations were manufactured, like products, where rumors could destroy careers overnight, where the pressure to perform did not end when the cameras stopped rolling. Lucille Ball entered this world as a young woman who knew she had to fight for every inch of ground she gained. Hollywood did not bend for actresses. It broke them first, reshaped them second, and in this furnace of ambition, loneliness, and relentless scrutiny, Lucille learned early that the heart had no place in show business. For the world, she was the queen of comedy. But comedy, as she once confessed to a close friend, was not born from happiness. It was born from survival. Every laugh she delivered on screen carried the weight of the battles she faced behind the curtain. Battles with studios, battles with expectations, battles within her marriage to Desi Arnaz, the man she loved fiercely yet suffered deeply alongside. Their on-screen chemistry created illusions of perfect harmony, but away from the spotlight. Their relationship was a storm that never settled. Desi's infidelity, his drinking, his unpredictable temper, and the emotional distance that grew between them left Lucille stranded in a life that looked glamorous but felt increasingly hollow. And in that emptiness, she reached for connection wherever she could find it, not out of scandal, not out of recklessness, but out of a need to feel seen beyond the character she played. Hollywood loved Lucy Ricardo, but few people truly loved Lucille Ball. The private woman beneath the legend struggled with immense pressure, self-doubt, and a marriage that eroded piece by piece. So when she spoke of those 6 men later in life, she did so not with pride or shame, but with a quiet honesty that carried a lifetime of exhaustion. Those who were present during one of her late-night confessions described a moment unlike anything they had ever witnessed from her. No punchline, no bravado, no attempt to soften the truth with humor. She sat in a dim living room, her posture slightly collapsed, her voice low, her eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the walls. It was in that fragile state that she spoke their names, not for gossip, but for relief. She said she had tried for years to bury the memories, but the past always finds a way to rise when the heart has carried too much for too long. She described the first actor as a man who swept into her life with charisma so powerful it frightened her. He was intoxicating and dangerous, someone who broke rules the way other people breathed. The second was a man whose gentleness filled a void Desi no longer could. The third was an old friend who slipped into her life at the precise moment when she felt she was losing control of everything else. The fourth was a co-star whose loneliness matched her own, and the gravity between them became impossible to ignore. The fifth was someone she should never have trusted, but in a moment of weakness, she did. And the sixth was a man the world adored, yet behind his fame hid a sorrow even darker than hers. But Lucille never spoke of these men as trophies or conquests. To her, they were evidence of the human heart's desperate need for warmth in a world built on fakery. She once said, according to notes preserved by a biographer, that she was not proud of every choice she made, but she could not deny the truth. Sometimes she simply needed someone to notice her pain when the world only wanted her laughter. Those affairs were not glamorous, not exciting, not the Hollywood fantasy people I imagine. They were moments of escape, moments of weakness, moments of longing for a life more stable than the one fame allowed her to have. When someone close to her asked whether she regretted those 6 men, she paused for a long time before answering. Then she said quietly, almost to herself, that she regretted nothing that reminded her she was still human. It was a sentence that revealed more about her inner world than any interview she ever gave in her long and celebrated career. Behind her achievements, behind her pioneering work as a woman in an industry dominated by men, behind her comedic genius, she was a woman carrying wounds she could not show on screen. The world adored Lucille Ball for her timing, her fearlessness, her hilariously exaggerated facial expressions, her ability to transform simple domestic scenes into unforgettable comedy. But off the stage, she struggled with fears no camera could capture. She worried about aging. She worried about being forgotten. She worried about losing the man she loved, even as he drifted further away. And in those fears, she sometimes made choices driven by emotion rather than reason. In the end, she did not reveal the 6 actors to shock anyone. She revealed them because she had spent a life team holding everything together for everyone else. She had carried the weight of being America's sweetheart. She had carried a marriage that fractured under the strain of fame. She had carried the responsibility of leading one of the biggest shows in television history, and she had carried secrets that chipped away at her spirit. That night, when she finally spoke the truth, she did so with the clarity of someone who had reached the end of her endurance. It was the beginning of a story far more complicated than any sitcom plotline. A story filled with longing, guilt, passion, and the unspoken cost of living a life larger than the screen could ever show. The morning after her quiet confession, the world outside Lucille Ball's window looked exactly the same as it always had. Sunlight over Los Angeles, palms swaying with artificial grace, cars pushing down Ventura Boulevard with the steady hum of a city that never cared who was hurting behind closed doors. Nothing changed. And yet, Lucille woke with a heaviness that came only from having spoken a truth buried for decades. She had revealed more than memories. She had revealed fractures that had shaped her life long before she became a household name. Lucille was never naive about the consequences of desire in Hollywood. She had seen too many careers implode, seen too many reputations rewritten by studios, desperate to protect their investments. If her secrets had come out in the 50s, she would not have been shielded by nostalgia or reverence. She would have been destroyed. She knew this. And it was precisely that awareness that made her step into each affair with a mixture of fear and resignation. She once admitted to a confidant that she did not choose those men out of recklessness. She chose them because, in those moments, the loneliness felt louder than caution. Her second confession, shared only years later. It was not about the men themselves, but about the version of herself she became with each of them. Hollywood demanded she be larger than life, but with those men she was small, vulnerable, flawed, frantic for something she could not name. She described it as trying to hold on to a rope that kept fraying between her fingers, a rope woven from ambition, exhaustion, and the aching need for tenderness she rarely received. The public might have, I imagined, glamorous meetings and whispered seductions, but Lucille remembered something far less cinematic. 2 people sitting in dimly lit rooms, bonded by private despair. The first of the 6 men had entered her life during a period of professional uncertainty. Her career had not yet reached the towering heights of I Love Lucy, and she feared she was destined for a lifetime of being almost famous. He told her she was brilliant, not in the forced politeness of studio executives, but with conviction that made her believe it for the first time. That belief drew her in. His attention, intoxicating. His flaws, impossible to ignore. Their affair was brief, but seared into her memory as the moment she realized how vulnerable she truly was. The second man, years later, was the opposite. He did not intoxicate her. He steadied her. He listened when she spoke of Desi's late-night absences and the growing cracks in her marriage. Lucille once said she felt as if she were drowning in a sea of laughter she herself created. And he became the one person who reached in with genuine calm instead of applause. Their connection formed not out of passion, but out of the illusion of safety. An illusion she admitted she needed more than truth. But it was the third man who would leave the deepest imprint. They had known each other for years, long before either tasted real fame. Their affection grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one night, when Lucille felt her world collapsing under the pressure of Desi's betrayals, she allowed herself to cross a line she had promised she never would. She later said it was the only affair that made her cry afterward, not out of guilt, but because she realized she had looked for solace in someone who mirrored her own brokenness. They both knew it could never last. Hollywood would have eaten them alive. Yet the memory remained carved into her life like a scar she never fully allowed to heal. The fourth man arrived in her life during the peak of her fame. She had everything the world said a woman should want: a hit show, adoration, influence. Yet she felt emptier than ever. Fame, she discovered, amplified loneliness rather than curing it. He was a co-star in another project, charming in the way actors are trained to be. But underneath the charisma lived a sadness she recognized instantly. Their affair burned fast and collapsed faster. A collision of two unstable hearts. She spoke of Chaim only once later in life, calling Chaim the man she had cared for the most but trusted the least. The fifth actor was the only one Lucille refused to name even in private conversations. She mentioned him only with bitterness, saying he represented a moment of weakness she wished she could erase. Those close to her suspected manipulation rather than romance, a dynamic that left her feeling used rather than understood. It was the only encounter she openly regretted, not because of scandal, but because it reminded her how fragile she had become at a time when the world insisted she be indestructible. And then there was the sixth, the man the world adored, the one she described with a mixture of affection and profound sadness. Their connection was not passionate, but deeply emotional. Both were icons, trapped inside the very personas that made them legends. Their affair was quiet, a fleeting sanctuary for two people suffocating under the expectations of millions. She said he was the only man who saw her clearly, not as Lucy Ricardo, not as a pioneer of television, but as a tired woman who carried too much. They parted without bitterness. They parted because they both knew that if anyone ever discovered the truth, Hollywood would rewrite their entire lives into something grotesque. After her confession, Lucille spent months avoiding any mention of the past. She had built her entire career on discipline, control, and the mastery of perception. To expose the most fragile mistakes of her life felt like peeling back skin she had spent decades hardening. She continued to work, continued to smile, continued to show the world the woman they adored. But late at night, alone with her thoughts, she began to wonder whether hiding those secrets for so long had cost her more than revealing them ever could. One of her private letters, written but never sent, contained a line that encapsulated the heart of her struggle. "I wanted love to rescue me, but all it ever did was remind me how lost I was." And in that single sentence, the foundation for the rest of her story was set. The 6 affairs were not the scandal. They were the symptom. A symptom of a life lived under a spotlight too bright for any human heart to withstand without breaking. In the years that followed her private admissions, Lucille Ball carried the memory of those 6 men like a collection of silent photographs tucked away in a drawer no one was allowed to open. She did not revisit them often, but they shaped her in ways she could no longer deny. And it was only with distance, emotional, geographical, and eventually generational, that she began to understand what those relationships had truly revealed about her life. She was not simply a woman who had affairs. She was a woman stranded between the demands of fame and the fragility of her own unmet needs. And as she moved deeper into her career, she discovered that the past had a way of resurfacing in the least expected moments. Lucille once told a biographer that the hardest part of aging was not the changing face in the mirror, but the memories she could no longer outrun. Hollywood, with all its relentless reinvention, does not allow its icons to forget who they used to be. Every rerun of her show, every photo request, every interview brought her back to a team when her fame was rising and her marriage collapsing. She could smile for the cameras, but inside her mind the past was a carousel of faces, voices, moments, and decisions she had never fully reconciled. Her marriage to Desi Arnaz, legendary on television, turbulent in reality, remained the central axis around which her secrets orbited. She loved Chaim with a ferocity that frightened both of them. Desi was the only man she married, the only man she built an empire with, the only man whose approval mattered more to her than the applause of millions. Yet he was also the man who wounded her most deeply. His late-night disappearances, his affairs, his drinking, his inability to stay still in the face of success, carved wounds into her heart that no studio makeup artist could conceal. Lucille later admitted that her relationships with those 6 actors were not betrayals of Desi, but escapes from the version of herself she became when she was with Chaim. She felt trapped in a cycle of devotion and disappointment, bound to a man whose brilliance came paired with self-destruction. She once described their marriage as a house built on fireworks, magnificent from afar, but dangerous for anyone inside. As she entered the middle stretch of her career, the emotional weight of these memories began to reshape her perception of love. She realized she had spent years sacrificing parts of herself for men who could not return the same devotion. Desi, with all his charm and genius, had never managed to give her the emotional consistency she craved. The 6 actors, despite their fleeting comfort, had not offered lasting solace. And Lucille began to recognize that much of her story had been written while she was simply trying to keep from falling apart. Work became her salvation. Television became the structure she leaned against when her personal life felt unbearably fragile. Every script, every rehearsal, every laugh track provided her with the discipline she needed to stay grounded. On set, she could control timing, emotion, rhythm. On set, she could rewrite endings. On set, she could choose when to cry and when to remain strong. It was the one place in her life where chaos bowed to her command. And yet, even there, shadows lingered. During one particularly demanding production week, an assistant noticed Lucille standing alone in an empty soundstage long after everyone else had left. She was staring at the spot where she and one of the 6 men had shared an unspoken moment years earlier. Nothing dramatic, nothing physical, just a brief connection between two people who understood the quiet devastation underneath their public personas. The assistant later described her expression not as regret, but as recognition, as if she were finally acknowledging the version of herself that had lived beneath the laughter. As the years passed, the six men became less about scandal and more about understanding the emotional architecture of her past. She could look back and see that each man represented something she lacked at the time: validation, safety, freedom, passion, distraction, and finally, understanding. She did not see them as mistakes, but as markers along a path she had been forced to walk alone. Hollywood rarely provided women with a safe space to process their pain, so they learned to hide it, fold it, tuck it away between scripts and call TIMs. Lucille's friends often wondered how she managed to survive the emotional turbulence of her life while maintaining such discipline in her career. She told them that pain was easier to carry when she kept moving, and work kept her in motion. But in rare, quiet moments, when she allowed herself to reflect, she acknowledged that her desire for connection had always been shaped by the loneliness of fame. The six actors had not filled that void. They had merely softened its edges. One evening, long after her pre-May, she found an old photograph of herself in her 30s. The woman in the picture was smiling broadly, wearing a costume from one of her early shows, her eyes bright with ambition. But Lucille saw something others would have missed: the exhaustion behind the smile, the silent yearning for stability, the fear of the mistakes she had not yet made. It was the face of a woman who had already begun to fracture, but did not yet know how deeply. In a rare moment of vulnerability, she told a close companion that she used to believe love was something she had to earn, something she had to perform for, something she had to keep alive through effort and sacrifice. But as she grew older, she realized the truth was far simpler and far more painful. She had chosen men who needed rescuing because she herself had never been rescued. And in trying to save them, she had lost pieces of herself she would never fully retrieve. By the team, she looked back on the six affairs with clarity. The men were all parts of distant history. Some had died. Some had vanished into the obscurity of old Hollywood. Some had reinvented themselves so many times she barely recognized the people they became. Yet the emotional imprint remained. These were the men who walked through her life during the moments when fame felt like a cage and love felt like a storm. And although she never intended for their names to be public, the truth of their existence shaped her journey more profoundly than any role she ever played. Lucille Ball was not defined by those six men, but she was undeniably changed by them. They were the mirrors she looked into when she needed to understand her own vulnerabilities. They were the echoes of choices made under the weight of loneliness, longing, and emotional hunger. And as she moved forward, she carried the lessons they left behind. That love cannot be forced, that devotion cannot survive neglect, and that the heart, no matter how famous its owner, remains fragile. As Lucille Ball moved into the later chapters of her life, the mythology of her past grew louder than the past itself. The world around her saw her as a titan, a history maker, the woman who changed television forever. But in the privacy of her mind, she wrestled not with her legacy, but with the fragments of the woman she used to be. Fame had preserved her face on screens across America, but the woman behind those images continued to evolve, fracture, and rebuild herself in ways the public would never witness. And it was in this evolution that the story of the six men became something entirely different. It was no longer a confession. It was a reckoning. Lucille began to understand that her life had been built around contradictions. She was a woman who commanded entire studios. Yet she struggled to control her own heart. She was adored by millions, yet often felt unseen by the people closest to her. She had created a character who embodied joy, spontaneity, and innocence, while she herself navigated a world filled with anxiety, betrayal, and quiet grief. And as she aged, these contradictions became harder to reconcile. She could no longer hide behind the rhythm of rehearsals or the predictable comfort of punchlines. Without the distraction of constant work, she was left alone with the echo of her own choices. There were nights when she sat by herself in her living room, watching old episodes of I Love Lucy, not out of pride, but out of curiosity. She once said to a confidant that she wanted to see what the rest of the world saw in her, because she had spent most of her life unable to see it herself. On screen, she appeared fearless, vibrant, unstoppable. Off-screen, she felt weighed down by memories she had never fully unpacked. She would lean back in her chair, arms folded, and whisper to herself that the woman on television was an invention, a necessary invention, but an invention nonetheless. It was during these quiet evenings that the 6 men drifted back into her consciousness. She did not remember them as lovers. She remembered them as emotional landmarks. With age came honesty, and with honesty came clarity. She no longer defended her decisions, nor did she condemn them. Instead, she examined them with the detachment of someone who finally understands the cost of survival. The first man represented youth reckless, hopeful, unsteady. When she thought of Chaim, she saw a younger version of herself, eager to be loved, desperate to be validated. She realized that she had stepped into that relationship because she believed attention was the same as love. It took a lifetime to understand they were not even related. The second man symbolized safety, or at least the illusion of it. She remembered his calm voice, his steady presence, his willingness to listen without judgment. But age allowed her to see what she could not then. That safety built on escape is not safety at all. It is only a temporary shelter from a storm that will return the moment you step outside. The third man resurfaced with a grief she could not ignore. Their connection had been meaningful, painful, undeniable. Looking back, she wished she could have preserved the friendship they once had without crossing the line that changed everything. But Time had softened her guilt. She understood now that 2 lonely souls often collide not out of desire, but out of desperation. And desperation is rarely kind. The fourth man brought to mind a period of chaos, success, and unbearable pressure. She saw him now as a reflection of her own instability at the height of her fame. They were 2 people holding on to each other not because they belonged together, but because neither had the strength to stand alone. Their relationship was a fire that burned fast, bright and dangerously, leaving behind a warmth she remembered faintly and an ache she remembered clearly. The fifth actor lingered as a shadow she rarely acknowledged. Even in old age, she refused to speak his name. But she could finally articulate why that chapter mattered. It was the moment she realized she had allowed herself to be treated as an object rather than a person. Hollywood had trained her to perform, to please, to adapt. But that affair was the moment she understood how deeply she had internalized those expectations. She did not regret the others, but she regretted Chaim, because he represented a version of herself she had worked tirelessly to bury. And then there was the sixth man, the quiet one, the one the world adored, the one who understood the isolation of fame because he lived inside his own gilded cage. As she aged, her memory of Chaim became less about romance and more about recognition. He was the only one who saw her without the mask, without the pressure, without the comedic armor she had worn for decades. In Chaim she found something she had rarely encountered in her life, a moment of peace, a moment of understanding, a moment where she felt human rather than legendary. These reflections did not haunt her. They humbled her. They reminded her of the complexity of being a woman in an industry that expected simplicity. They revealed the emotional terrain she had crossed to become the icon the world celebrated. And they allowed her to finally acknowledge the truth she had avoided for most of her life. She had spent years trying to fill emotional voids, created long before Hollywood ever discovered her. One evening, during a conversation with a younger actress seeking advice, Lucille said something that would never appear in any official biography. She said that the greatest mistake a woman can make in Hollywood is confusing the applause for affection. Applause fades the moment the camera stops rolling. Affection, if it ever comes, is quiet, steady, and incapable of being scripted. She leaned back, inhaled sharply, and added that she wished she had learned that sooner. The actress asked if she was referring to her marriage or to the 6 men. Lucille smiled, weary and wise, and replied that she was referring to herself. She had spent years looking for love she had never given herself. It was in these final chapters that Lucille began to heal, not through confession, not through apology, but through the simple act of acknowledging what had been true all along. She was a woman who had done her best in a world that demanded perfection. She had loved imperfectly, survived fiercely, and built a legacy unmatched by anyone who came after her. And the 6 men, once sources of confusion, longing, and guilt, became symbols of a journey she could finally accept. In the twilight years of her life, Lucille Ball developed a habit she never shared publicly. Some nights, long after the house had settled into silence, she would walk into her office and carefully open a drawer filled with old letters, scripts, and photographs. She never lingered too long on any single item, but the ritual grounded her. It reminded her that her life had been lived in chapters, some bright, some dark, all of them undeniably hers. And among those relics of memory, she kept a small envelope with no date and no name written on it. Inside that envelope was a single sheet of paper that had yellowed with time. On it, in her own handwriting, she had written a sentence that defined her late life reflections. "I have forgiven everyone except the younger version of myself." That single line revealed the truth she had spent decades avoiding. Lucille did not resent the 6 men, nor Desi, nor the world that had demanded so much from her. What she resented was the part of herself that had believed she needed to earn love through sacrifice, secrecy, and silence. As she aged, she realized that she had lived much of her life in emotional debt, constantly paying for choices she made when she had been too exhausted to choose differently. Yet, forgiveness did not come suddenly. It arrived slowly, through the accumulation of quiet moments, conversations with friends, reflections during interviews, and late-night thoughts that surfaced when the house grew still. The 6 men who had once occupied her hidden memories began to appear differently in her mind. Their faces blurred into symbols rather than individuals, each representing a version of Lucille she had once been. She remembered the younger Lucille who stepped onto studio lots for the first time, trembling with ambition, desperate to prove she belonged. That woman had believed validation would heal old wounds. She forgave her. She remembered the Lucille who fell in love with Desi and believed that passion alone could stabilize a storm. That woman had mistaken intensity for intimacy. She forgave her too. She remembered the middle-aged Lucille who sought momentary comfort in the arms of men who were themselves fractured. That woman had been drowning in a life that demanded strength she no longer possessed. She forgave her most of all. In her later years, Lucille rarely mentioned the affairs, but those who knew her well could tell when her mind drifted back to the past. Her expression would soften, her posture would relax, and for a brief moment, the sharp edges of her personality would fade. She was not nostalgic, nor was she remorseful. She was contemplative, processing the emotional architecture of a life that had been far more complicated than the public ever understood. During an interview in the 80s, a journalist asked her if she believed she had been misunderstood. Lucille paused, then said something that startled even those close to her. "I think I misunderstood myself." It was an admission that revealed the depth of her introspection. For all the love she received from the public, she had spent little of her life truly understanding her own heart. The interviewer asked if she had any regrets. She shook her head slowly. "Regrets? No. Mistakes. Thousands. But mistakes are simply the footprints of a life lived fully." The room fell silent. Those present later said they had never seen Lucille speak with such clarity. She was not defending herself, nor excusing her past. She was acknowledging the full scope of her humanity. Her reflections deepened as she watched the entertainment industry evolve. Younger actresses came to her for advice, not about fame, but about survival. They wanted to know how she endured the pressures, the betrayals, the loneliness. She told them the truth. Stripped of glamour, you survive by knowing who you are before the world tells you what you should be. And she said she wished someone had told her that when she was young. In these conversations, she sometimes spoke obliquely about the 6 men, not their identities, not their actions, but the emotional context that led her to them. She told one young actress that loneliness can disguise itself as desire, and that the heart will sometimes reach for the closest source of warmth rather than the healthiest one. She told another that fame amplifies every emotion, even the ones you try to bury. And she told a third that secrets gain power only when you refuse to name the pain behind them. But the most revealing conversation took place at her home one cloudy afternoon near the end of her life. A close companion asked her if she believed the affairs defined her. Lucille looked out the window for a long time, watching the wind ripple through the trees. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "No, they didn't define me. They revealed me. There is a difference. They revealed what I needed, what I lacked, what I feared, and what I didn't yet understand about myself. They were not chapters I'm proud of or ashamed of. They are simply chapters no one else ever had to read." She leaned back, exhaled slowly, and added something she had never told anyone before. "I think I was looking for someone to hold me together when the world started pulling me apart." That sentence stayed with the companion for years. It became the key to understanding Lucille Ball's emotional life. The 6 men were not scandals. They were survival mechanisms. They were stepping stones across a river she had spent her entire life trying to cross. They were reminders that even the strongest women can be fragile, and even the most iconic figures can be undone by the desire to feel truly seen. As Lucille grew older, she found peace, not by rewriting her past, but by accepting it. She understood that her journey had been shaped by pressures she never asked for, expectations she never agreed to, and circumstances she never fully controlled. She recognized that her heart had been both her greatest gift and her most vulnerable flaw. And she finally understood that the younger version of herself, the one she struggled to forgive, had simply done the best she could with the tools she had. In her final years, Lucille's laughter became softer. But her wisdom grew sharper. She stopped comparing herself to the woman she had been on screen. She stopped punishing herself for decisions made in desperation. She stopped searching for answers in the past and began finding them in the stillness of the present. The 6 men faded into the background of her memory. Not erased, but integrated. They were no longer sources of shame, confusion, or longing. They were simply part of her story. And as she often reminded young women, the measure of a life is not found in its flawless moments, but in the courage a person shows when facing their imperfections. In the final stretch of her life, Lucille Ball found herself confronting a truth she had spent decades avoiding. Legacy is not built from perfection, but from the long, winding record of a person's humanity. For years, she had believed her work alone would define her, that laughter could erase the fractures beneath the surface. But as she grew older, she began to understand that the world remembers not only what someone created, but who they were beneath the applause. And it was in this realization that the story of the 6 men, once hidden in silence, took on a new dimension. She never intended those secrets to be public, yet she carried them with a weight that aged her more than any character she played. In her late-life reflections, she often spoke about the cost of living in a world that demanded greatness but offered little compassion. Hollywood preserved her image at the height of her beauty, yet compassionately ignored the complexities of the woman behind it. She came to accept that she had spent much of her life performing roles even off-screen, adjusting herself to the needs, desires, and expectations of others. And it was this lifelong habit of performance that shaped not only her career, but her relationships. One afternoon, while sitting with a close friend in her living room, she admitted something she had carried silently for years. She said she believed the 6 men entered her life not because she was weak, but because she was human. She had loved deeply, perhaps too deeply, and had sought comfort in moments when her world felt unsteady. It was not scandal she feared, but misunderstanding, the idea that the world would judge her choices without ever grasping the emotional storm behind them. She said that for the first half of her life, she felt like a passenger in her own story, pulled forward by the momentum of fame and obligation rather than her own desires. Her friend asked whether she had ever truly been in love after Desi. Lucille paused before answering. She said love, in the romantic sense, had shifted for her over the years. It was no longer a fire that consumed her, but a quiet warmth she recognized in small gestures, in memories, in glances across rooms, but she admitted that none of the 6 men had given her what she had given them: certainty. She had been searching for something in each of them that could not be found in any single person, because what she truly sought was stability within herself. As she entered her final decade, Lucille grew more introspective. She read old journal entries. It reviewed letters she had kept sealed for years, and revisited moments from her past with a newfound clarity. She discovered that the younger version of herself had been driven by fear of abandonment, fear of insignificance, fear that the world might one day stop applauding. It was this fear, not desire, that had guided many of her relationships. The 6 men had not been choices of romance, but choices of survival. And understanding that distinction brought her a kind of peace she had never known. During a speaking engagement late in life, Lucille addressed a small crowd of aspiring performers. She told them success would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. She warned them that fame magnifies every flaw and amplifies every insecurity. She explained that the greatest challenge in show business was not rejection, but the slow erosion of one's sense of self. After the event, a young woman approached her privately and asked how she had managed to endure, Lucille replied with a kind of honesty that startled them both. She said she survived because she finally stopped pretending she was unbreakable. She learned to accept her failures as part of her story, rather than parts she needed to hide. Those who were close to her in her final years often remarked on how different she seemed from the woman they had known during the height of her fame. She was softer, more reflective, less guarded. She no longer spoke with the defensive humor that once shielded her from vulnerability. Instead, she shared her thoughts with a calmness that came from having walked through fire and emerged with her integrity intact. On one particularly quiet evening, she invited her daughter to sit with her by the fireplace. They talked about many things: family, work, mistakes, forgiveness. Toward the end of their conversation, Lucille surprised her daughter by mentioning the 6 men. She did not reveal their names. She did not recount the details. Instead, she spoke about what those chapters had taught her. She said they showed her how easy it was to lose oneself while trying to hold others together. They revealed to her the importance of choosing people who nurture rather than deplete. They taught her that loneliness cannot be cured by proximity, and that affection without consistency only deepens the wounds it tries to heal. Her daughter asked if she regretted those chapters. Lucille shook her head. She said regret is a luxury for people who believe they could have made different choices. But she had lived through pressures her daughter would never fully understand. Pressures that bent her decisions in directions she could not control. She explained that the real tragedy was not the affairs themselves, but the silence she kept afterward, the years she spent punishing herself for decisions she made out of emotional exhaustion rather than cruelty. The most touching reflection came near the end. In a moment of surprising clarity, Lucille said, "She often I imagined what her life might have been if she had loved herself with the same intensity she had loved others. She wondered how many of her wounds could have healed sooner, how many mistakes she might have avoided, and how many years she could have lived without carrying the weight of guilt." She acknowledged that the world saw her as a pioneer, a trailblazer, a legend. Yet, she saw herself as a woman who learned too late how essential self-compassion truly is. In her last interviews, Lucille spoke not about fame, nor about her greatest achievements, but about the emotional truth she had finally reached. She said she hoped people would remember her not for her perfection, but for her willingness to keep going despite her imperfections. She said she hoped her story would teach others that no one, not even the brightest stars, is free from the need for tenderness. And she hoped that by the time she left this world, she had forgiven herself for being human. The 6 men, once shadows in the corridors of her memory, became symbols of a journey she could finally claim without shame. They were lessons. They were reflections. They were reminders of the moments when she had reached for comfort because her heart had nowhere else to go. And in accepting them, she accepted herself. In the final years of her life, Lucille Ball lived in a balance between memory and release. She carried the weight of her past not with shame, but with a kind of weathered grace that comes only to those who have looked at themselves honestly and survived the reflection. Her story on screen, in the spotlight, had always been told through bright colors, bold expressions, and explosive laughter. But the story she whispered to those closest to her was quieter, deeper, shaded by the many emotional landscapes she had crossed. It was the story of a woman who had lived beyond the limits of what the public ever imagined, and who, at the end, came to understand that the measure of her life would never be found in scandal. But in her humanity, in her final interviews, she spoke less of success and more of truth. She was no longer interested in maintaining the image of a flawless trailblazer. She wanted the world to know that even icons fracture, even legends bleed. And even the strongest spirits sometimes reach for comfort in ways they do not fully understand. When she sat down with a journalist for what would be one of her last televised conversations, she surprised Haim by saying that the hardest part of aging was not the passing of Time, but the gradual softening of one's defenses. The older you get, she said, the more your truth refuses to stay buried. It rises, whether you invite it or not. When the journalist gently asked what truth had risen most clearly for her, Lucille smiled faintly, as if recognizing a question she had been preparing her entire life to answer. She said the greatest revelation was that she had spent decades seeking validation from others' audiences, colleagues, partners, without ever learning how to give that validation to herself. She admitted that the 6 men she had spoken about privately were not stories she carried out of regret, but out of recognition. They reminded her of the version of herself who once believed she needed someone else to confirm her worth. She said the real transformation in her life came not from forgiving them, but from forgiving the woman she had been when she met them. One evening, a few months before her death, Lucille invited 2 close friends to her home. They sat in a quiet corner of her living room, the lights dim, the air heavy with a rare stillness. She spoke candidly about her fears she had never voiced during her years of fame. She admitted that she was terrified the world would one day remember only the laughter and forget the woman who created it. She worried that her mistakes would overshadow her achievements. She feared that the tender parts of her story, the parts she had kept locked away, would disappear with her. Her friends assured her that her impact was far too large, far too profound, to ever be erased. But Lucille shook her head. Impact is not the same as remembrance, she said quietly. People remember the illusion. I hope, someday, they remember the woman. That simple sentence carried the weight of everything she had learned. She had spent a lifetime being mythologized, adored, imitated, but rarely understood. She wanted her story to be seen not as the arc of a flawless icon, but as the journey of a woman who fought through shadows to bring light to others. In her final days, Lucille did something unusual. She asked her assistant to bring her an old box from the back of her closet. Inside were mementos, photographs of castmates, letters from fans, scripts covered in handwritten notes, and small personal trinkets she had collected throughout her career. She sorted through them carefully, placing some aside, discarding others. When her assistant asked what she was doing, she said she wanted to choose which parts of her story she was willing to leave behind, and which parts she hoped would follow her. Near the bottom of the box was the envelope she had kept hidden for decades, the one with the single sentence written in her own hand. She read it again slowly. I have forgiven everyone except the younger version of myself. But this Time, as she held the paper between her fingers, she felt something shift. She whispered to herself that she was finally ready to let that go. Then she folded the paper gently and placed it back into the envelope, not to hide it, but to preserve it as a reminder that healing, even when delayed, was still healing. One of her closest confidants later said that Lucille spent her final nights in a state of unusual calm. She spoke about Desi with a tenderness people had not heard in years. She reflected on their marriage not as a failure, but as a profound chapter that shaped both of their lives. She spoke of the 6 men, not with secrecy, but with acceptance. She said they represented the pieces of herself she had been searching for: strength, attention, safety, passion, distraction, understanding, and she said she hoped that, in speaking of them honestly, she had finally freed herself from the guilt she had carried for so long. Shortly before her passing, Lucille wrote one last note that she never mailed. It read, "If anyone ever tells my story, tell them I was complicated. Tell them I was afraid. Tell them I made mistakes. But tell them I kept going. Tell them the laughter came from a place of truth. And tell them I loved deeply, even when it cost me." Those words, discovered after her death, became the heart of her legacy. They revealed not the comedic genius, nor the Hollywood titan, but the woman behind the myth, the woman who built her world from both brilliance and brokenness. After her passing, journalists, fans, and historians attempted to piece together the true story of her emotional life. Some focused on the scandals, others on the triumphs. But the people who knew her best insisted that the truth lay somewhere in between. She was not simply the star who revolutionized television. She was a woman who navigated heartbreak, who sought comfort in imperfect places, who carried the weight of fame with both dignity and vulnerability. In the end, the question surrounding the six men was not who they were, but what they revealed. They revealed a woman searching for warmth in the cold machinery of Hollywood. They revealed a heart bruised by the demands of fame. They revealed the private aching of someone who spent her life performing joy while quietly learning how to feel it. Lucille Ball's legacy is embroidered with laughter, but lined with truth. The world remembers her as an icon, but those who look deeper see the fuller portrait. A woman who stumbled, reached, wounded, healed, and lived with a depth that no sitcom script could ever contain. And perhaps that is the greatest ending her story could have, not perfection, but humanity